Okay, so let's review. We're trying to explain how it came to be that white Protestant conservatives, who once were divided between the Democratic and Republican parties, became affiliated in huge numbers with one party, the Republican Party, and how African American Christians became affiliated in huge numbers with the Democratic Party. That's where we're going. We've seen a lot of the bits and pieces. Now we're going to hone in on a few things that we set up in the last video. So what I'm focused here on this bit is how or why white religious conservatives began to identify with one party. That's what we're trying to explain. And there are multiple pieces to this explanation. I should tell you now that this is a very contested history, and it's contested in part because historians contest things. We read documents, we think about what they mean, we try to figure out what causes are most important or what must have priority. This is also a contested issue, though, because depending on what you emphasize in the list of things that contributed to the religious right, it can look like a better or worse movement morally, again, sort of depending on where you stand politically. But as you'll see, there is one of these that if you emphasize it as the primary driver, the religious right looks worse and worse. If you emphasize other things, it, for a lot of people, doesn't look so bad. So this is a contested history because you're trying to figure out how much one thing, particularly race, contributed to the rise of a major political movement. All right, so pieces of the puzzle. What contributed to the rise of the religious right? I think historians would say there are four things. Again, they're going to give them different weight and priority. One is the growing power of the federal government. Two is race. Three is gender. And four is something called secular humanism. Now, the telling of this gets complicated because all of these work together at various points. You can't just neatly divide them. Sorry, I got interrupted by a child. I have no idea where I am. Right, these four things interrelate. So as I try and go through this, I'll separate them out a little bit, but they're going to get meshy and enmeshed, which is part of the reason historians have a hard time figuring out exactly which one to prioritize, because they all work together in various ways. Growth of the federal government. We already talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to go back. Again, in the 1930s, the New Deal increased federal presence in daily life. Before then, for a lot of people, the post office might have been really their only encounter with the federal government on a regular basis. Income tax didn't even happen until the early part of the 20th century. So the New Deal, when you get a card with a number on it that's going to be able to track you and give you money, for a lot of people seemed like a federal government run amok, one that really was going to have a lot of power in your life. Now, again, there were people who were skeptical of government power, but liked aspects of the New Deal. But still, there were for some people this deep concern that a strong federal government is one that could easily take away your rights as help you. There's also then the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement showed something to people beyond what it did in terms of race. And that's that the federal government was going to intervene in the South. Not always consistently, not as quickly as the civil rights movement wanted it to, but eventually, in the 1950s and the 1960s, the federal government did come into the South and enforce civil rights law. So here's a famous picture of young Ruby Bridges, who is tasked at her young age to desegregate a school, and she has national figures around her, people from the national government sent in to protect her. This was a very clear message to people in the South. The federal government wasn't going to leave the South alone. It would come in it would enforce civil rights law. There was going to be no kind of sense of protection from the South from this growing federal government. Keep that in your head. We're moving on now to another piece of the rise of the religious right, race. This again is the most contested part. I don't know of any historian who says that race played no part in the rise of religious right. The question is, how much of a part does race play in the rise of the religious right? Again, there are some people who say that this is basically the entire reason for the rise of the religious right, or really the most important reason. Sorry, another child interruption. Depending on how you talk about the race component of the religious right, it really can sound more or less like a white identity movement. So just keep that in mind. As historians talk about this, they prioritize the importance of race in the development of the religious right differently. Here are some things that I think are widely agreed upon. In 1964, the Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater ran on a states' rights platform. This was significant. So I'm going to go back 4 years. In 1960, Richard Nixon had been the Republican candidate for president. For those of you who are confused, yes, Richard Nixon ran for president more than once. And he lost to John F. Kennedy. But he had a substantial amount of support in the African American community. Around 30% of African Americans identified as Republicans at that point and voted for Richard Nixon. Jackie Robinson campaigned on behalf of Nixon. The Republicans were seen as maybe not as consistent on civil rights as some of the Democrats, but they were seen as fairly reliable. And again, remember, there is a spectrum here in the Republican Party, more conservative Republicans to more progressive Republicans. In 1964, Barry Goldwater ran, and Goldwater was a very different kind of candidate. Goldwater was more akin to the kind of Republican coming out of the Southern California synthesis of white Southern Democrats becoming Republicans in an already fairly conservative Republican Party in that part of Southern California. This was a Republican Party that was more libertarian on economics and also advocated for states' rights. Barry Goldwater, although not of Southern California, he was from Arizona, I believe, ran on a platform of states' rights. Now again, states' rights are one of those things that different people kind of hear this differently. For a lot of conservatives, states' rights simply means local control, which is something they believe in. They think that power should be aggregated at the lowest level possible, so it exists most closely to the local people. However, in the history of the United States, states' rights has also been affiliated with movements that have attempted to, say, secede from the Union or to take away rights from African Americans. So states' rights were a way of talking about states being able to enforce their own laws that, say, then made poll taxes a requirement for being able to vote and essentially deprived African Americans of the vote. States' rights then was a campaign slogan that was not going to win a lot of African American support, and it gained much more support in the white South than any other Republican campaign, presidential campaign, had been able to, going back to Abraham Lincoln. Barry Goldwater did not win the election. He lost fairly badly, but he gained more support in the white South than any other Republican candidate had for a very, very, well, ever had. We begin to see here then a change in party affiliation among white Southerners that takes a while, but as this part of the Republican Party, which again was a part of the Republican Party, began to gain more national prominence, white Southerners began to associate with it more. That's one part. The other part of that historians who emphasize the race component here talk about is a movement in the 1970s to protect private schools from Internal Revenue Service rules about tax-exempt status. Now, if that sounds incredibly technical, let me try and break it down. The sign I have here is for Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist university in South Carolina that in the early 1970s did not allow interracial dating. In the early 1970s, the IRS created a rule saying that it was going to look very seriously at private schools, whether they were K-12 schools that had arisen after desegregation or colleges that had any kind of racially discriminatory rules, or simply had a disproportionate number of white children. A group of religiously conservative leaders got together, led by the name of Paul Weyrich, and started thinking about how to combat this IRS rule. Now, importantly, this rule was made under a Republican presidential administration, under Richard Nixon's administration. He eventually won the presidency. So this wasn't a Democratic imposition. This was a Republican rule. But a group of religious conservatives began to think about how to combat this rule. When Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980, he promised this group of conservative leaders that he would support them, that his administration would not work to deprive these private institutions of their tax-exempt status because of their racial policies or admissions policies. His administration did not live up to that promise. They did allow the case to go to the Supreme Court, and Bob Jones lost that case, but Ronald Reagan did at least promise this group of, again, religious conservatives that he would be on their side. For historians for whom race plays a major role, they really look at this second piece here, the creation of a group of religious conservatives who banded together to think about how to protect what some people called segregation academies, as really the genesis of the religious right, as an attempt by a group of people acting in order to keep white institutions white, to create a political movement that would align with the Republican Party in order to protect itself. For a lot of historians, that really is the key story of the religious right. I'm going to treat it as an important story. I think the group of people who got together and who wanted to protect these institutions are a key component in creating a religiously conservative kind of political elite who saw the kind of conservative branch of the Republican Party as one that it could very much use for its purposes. I don't think that's a sufficient story. I do think it's an important part of the story. So what else is a part of the story? Well, to do that, I'm going to look at a brochure from a place called Liberty Christian Academy, now known as Liberty University. This was a school created by Jerry Falwell, who was a Southern pastor in Virginia. He had not supported the civil rights movement. He had actually strongly opposed it, saying that pastors shouldn't get involved in politics. But over the years, that changed for Falwell, and he became a political activist. This brochure comes out of his school that started after desegregation. It's called 5 Things We Think You'll Like About Lynchburg Christian Academy. This is going to be incredibly hard to see. First, they say quality education. Students who graduate from Lynchburg Christian Academy receive a diploma from a fully accredited school. They think it's much better than the average public school. All right, that seems pretty basic. No drug problem. The drug problem in America is at epidemic levels. It goes on to say that although we can't promise that no student at our school has ever done drugs, we don't have a drug problem. These are key. Bible reading and prayer are legal at Lynchburg Christian Academy. Unlike the public schools where you're no longer allowed to have teacher-led prayer, our schools do. 4, we have no hippies. Neatness of appearance, proper length of hair for boys, and right attitudes towards elders are all part of the education. 5, our students are taught to love America. I want you to, again, to think about what's going on in this advertisement. There are other things you'll like also. We teach respect for parents. And then I think this is a key line. You can tell our boys from the girls without a medical examination. Old-fashioned morality is taught and practiced. What's going on here? Well, I think a lot of things. A lot of them have to do with gender and eventually abortion. Here's what I mean. What we see in that advertisement from Lynchburg Christian Academy is a number of things: a concern with authority, and a concern with drugs, a concern with prayer, and a concern with gender. One of the things that historians have argued happens out of the 1960s among religious conservatives is a change from a focus on God ordering the world through race to God ordering the world through gender. The shift is one that makes some sense. In fact, it makes a lot of sense. One of the things that happens out of the 1960s is a lot of religious conservatives, particularly in the South, come forward and say, we were wrong. God didn't order the world based on a segregation of race. It just didn't. God didn't mean for the races to be separate. So Jerry Falwell, for example, who said that the civil rights movement was wrong, eventually comes and says, no, I was wrong. Segregation was wrong. Liberty University is, don't have numbers in front of me, but I'm willing to bet is at least as, if not more, racially diverse than Gustavus. So white Southerners said, we were wrong about segregation. That's not how God orders the world. However, God does order the world, and God does it based on gender. You go back to the very beginning, to Genesis. God created them. Male and female, God created them. There are passages in the New Testament that talk about the proper relationship between husbands and wives. Jesus talks about the importance of marriage. For a lot of religious conservatives, they came and said, we were very, very wrong about how God ordered the world. Not that God does. Not that God doesn't create institutions that are supposed to keep us in line, but we were wrong about which ones. We emphasized race when we really should have emphasized gender. This had the benefit of being a lot more biblically defensible than God ordering the world based on race. Really hard to defend that. That God does it through gender, certainly not all people who read the Bible think that that's true, but it's a possible reading of the Bible. What a lot of religious conservatives saw happening in the 1960s was a breakdown of gender, a breakdown in the roles that men and women were supposed to play in the home, in the workplace, and in the nation. So Lynchburg Christian Academy says one of the strengths of our institution is that we keep boys boys and girls girls. Boys have short haircuts, girls wear their hair long. We don't do this gender bending kind of thing. Then in the 1970s, you add those already existent concerns to the feminist movement, and particularly to abortion. In 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that abortion was a right, which meant that it would be legal across the country. Now, Roe v. Wade did not change, sorry, let me go back. There were states that already allowed abortion. So what Roe v. Wade did was to allow it in states that didn't allow it. That's an actually important point today. A lot of people think if you overturn Roe v. Wade, that will then end abortion in the country altogether. What it does is it sends it back to the states, and so different states would have different abortion laws. But in 1973, Roe v. Wade said abortion was legal across the country. At the time, interestingly, a lot of religious conservatives didn't make a lot of Roe v. Wade. Some were uncomfortable with it, certainly. Some sort of said, well, abortion is a Catholic issue. We just don't care that much about it. They didn't think it was that big of a deal. Some said that biblically it really seemed that a fetus wasn't human until born. In the 1970s, however, a man named Francis Schaeffer, along with C. Everett Koop, who became the Surgeon General under Reagan, produced a book and then a video series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And Schaeffer and Koop argued that abortion was the logical outcome of a society that no longer took God seriously. In other words, what they said was this: you have a society that at one time had been based on God's authority, that had seen law as derived from God and only valid if it was in line with God. And then in the 1960s, the Supreme Court came and said that you didn't need to have prayer in schools. You couldn't have teacher-led prayer in schools or Bible reading in schools. The federal government came and took out the foundation of government, that is God, and put at the center of law humans. And the thing they say about humans is that humans are inconsistent. They change. They decide new things. They go one direction and they go the other. What you get when you have a law based on human reason is law that has no real foundation at all. It just means whatever people think it means at the time, and that can mean anything. And we know it's bad because we now have legalized abortion nationwide. What do you get when you allow humans to be at the center of law instead of God? You get mothers who kill their children. This was a very powerful message for a lot of religious conservatives. A lot of religious conservatives who may or may not have been that deeply concerned about abortion in 1973, over the course of the 1970s, began to think a very, very important issue, perhaps the most important issue in America. And they saw multiple things coming together. The fear of secular humanism that had started earlier, but certainly since 1962, and the rulings about school prayer and Bible reading had become more and more important. They see, in other words, a federal government that has decided to be atheist, has decided not to obey God, has decided to live as if God didn't exist. How do we know that that's really breaking down? Well, because our country is no longer abiding by the way that God has structured society. Women are leaving the home, women are killing their children, men are allowing their children to be killed. Abortion became kind of the issue that showed all of the other problems. And among other things, what abortion showed is that if you have a strong federal government that will do things like declare abortion legal in all states, or declare that school prayer is illegal in all states, then you need to do a couple of things. You need to, A, get control of that federal government and decrease its power, and B, get your people in charge of the federal government. How are you going to do that? Well, one way is to align with one political party. Rather than having your people kind of branch out and some of them be Democrats and some of them be Republicans, find a political party who will work for the kinds of things that you want. In 1980, this group called the Religious Right found a candidate that seemed willing to work with them in Ronald Reagan. And according to a lot of accounts, they helped elect him. They were a significant proportion of his strength in the primaries and then in the presidential election. And you had, in 1980, a lot of white Southerners affiliate with the Republican Party, which was now a really national party. It had strength in both the North and the South. And these same people have left the Democratic Party. And as we'll see in a second, that means something significant for both parties.